My name is Sean Roy, and I am with an organization called TransCen. I'm being joined by my colleagues today, Laura Owens and Deschamps. And what we're going to do is try to have a little bit of a less formal presentation and more of a conversation style today as we dig into some of these concepts. Josie asked us a while back to think about how we can encourage those who advocate for families to kind of reimagine the role of family advocates and working with families around transition. And we had a lot of fun doing that. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I am a former parent center staff myself, having spent 15 years at Minnesota's Parent Center, PACER, and have I've taken the calls, I've done the workshops, I've experienced some of the ups and downs. And one of the things that Josie and I came upon is that the idea that a lot of times within family serving organizations, transition ends up being a separate project. It ends up being sometimes fully funded, sometimes not fully funded. You have your own desk in the corner and you get the phone calls. You know, somebody calls and says that their kid is a certain age, the slips automatically, and that shows my age, right? We still use pink slips when I was still there. The slips came to Sean, right? Because I was the transition guy. And what we want to do is talk a little bit about how we can encourage you to think about transition a little bit broadly. And so we want to really walk you through, the present day reality of working within systems and what the future can look like, not only for families, but for you in terms of the advocacy work that you're doing and what that means in terms of changing our mindsets around this idea of systems and talking to families about transition in a certain way. And then getting into how do we get there. The information that we are presenting today is also encapsulated in a couple of briefs that we have written here at TransCen and are going to be released to you within the next month and a half. We're currently formatting them as we speak. And it's all, one is for families, one is for professionals, and it's all around these same ideas. And so you will have kind of a takeaway here in a little bit that you can use with staff and families as well. So again, Laura Owens and Ann Deschamps, and we're just going to have a conversation. We're going to ask that you hold questions until the end, but a good idea might be if there's something that pops up, when Laura says something amazing, go ahead and either react in the chat box, because we love real-time reactions too. Or if you think of a question, go ahead and throw it there. And I know that Johan is monitoring the chat box for us. And so you don't have to hold your questions. You can throw them in there in real time so you don't lose the thought. So a lot of what we're talking about, and I want to bring in Laura for this very first question here. A lot of what we're talking about in terms of reimagining advocacy has to do with this idea of working within systems. And so I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about, in your mind, systems. What is the nature and the role that they play in people's lives?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So it's really important, as Sean said, that transition has been around for a really long time, yet the outcomes for youth with disabilities are still pretty dismal. And I teach a class on transition to teachers, and I still feel like transition is kind of the stepchild in education. And part of it is, I think, the systems thinking that we have when it comes to transition. And so if we look at kind of our systems, we have vocational rehabilitation as one system, and ultimately we hope that churns through the cogs and leads to employment. We have the Centers for Independent Living, and again, hopefully we hope that goes through the cogs and leads to some type of independent living. Schools, K-12 and beyond, again, hopefully that will lead to lifelong learning, future education, post-secondary education. And then finally, Social Security and work, kind of moving through that cog, leading to financial literacy. And I think that when we think about systems, it's really important to think about the systems that we're in, the systems that we've established, and understand that a system is really just a mechanism that consistently produces and maintains an outcome. And right now, those outcomes are not really where we want them to be. So the mechanism is designed by the collective values, the worldviews, and priorities of the people who develop the system in order to achieve specific outcomes. So if we look at the next slide, we can kind of see how the systems actually work, is that we have people who have kind of their worldviews of transition and what transition from school to adult life should look like. And then that leads to your values, your specific values. So we kind of look at the global worldview of where we think about transition and youth with disabilities and employment and post-secondary education and independent living, which leads to our own personal values about those ideas, which then kind of blends into these policies and practices that we have within our systems. That hopefully bleed into our goals, that leads to some type of function that supports the outcome that we're working for. So the policies and practices that we put in place within our systems are leading to those outcomes, that ultimate function. And I think what's really important to remember as we look at the next slide, as it relates to our work with systems, is that we have a tendency to blame systems. We have a tendency to say, well, that's a systems issue. That's why students aren't graduating into employment, or that's why Social Security is an issue. It's a systems issue. But what we have to remember is that people create those systems. So that idea that we have this worldview, so we have IDEA, we have WIOA, we have these worldviews of what we want for outcomes. Our policies and practices tend to kind of get stuck in that system. And then instead of figuring out a way to move beyond that, we kind of blame that system and say it's the system's issue, it's the system's problem. People aren't graduating into post-secondary education, or they want to stay on Social Security, SSI. But we have to remember that we can change those systems. And so in order to move things forward, we have to be responsible, because changing systems means changing people, changing the way we think about things. So I think that that's really what we want people to leave here with, is kind of, we're going to go back to this, but understanding that we are the enemy and he is us. Sometimes we are the people who are creating the systems for which we blame for the dismal outcomes for students with disabilities. So I want to just know if you would just type in the chat box a little bit about, what do you see the nature of your systems that you're currently working in? If you could just type in a couple of ideas, and that would be great. And if not, we'll just move on to the next slide. But I really am curious about what people think about how they might be stuck in certain systems.
And I wanted to give Anne an opportunity to respond to what Laura had said, but I want to just chime in and say that as a former parent center staff, a lot of the parent centers were created to train families on systems. Mm-hmm. I know that Minnesota's PTI was originally a very small grant to help train parents on the newly created special education law. And so just by nature, I think that, the family projects and systems have a very interesting relationship. But Anne, what do you think about this idea of systems?
Well, I think as Laura said, systems are a response to policies, and especially transition. As somebody who's been in transition and working in transition since 1987, my very first transition job was on a federally funded demonstration project, because we didn't know what transition was. but it was all about, you know, federal funding and let's create this system to assist students with disabilities in transitioning out of the school system into the adult service system. And again, I think one of the points I'm going to be making over and over again here is it all starts with language. And here, the other important thing I want to underline what Laura said is that we do create the systems that we're functioning with, and we keep them going by continuing to work within the systems. And the only way it's going to change is if we change our thinking, and that starts with changing our language.
So then, having that be said, you know, it seems as though we're going towards this idea that there are problems with systems, or at least this idea of systems level thinking. And so throwing it to you, Anne, what are the pitfalls of kind of focusing on systems as the be all end all?
Well, what happened, Sean, and I'm curious if the audience agrees with this, is that very early in a young adult's educational career, you start to hear talk about, do you have information about the adult system? Are you on this waiting list? So you're automatically starting early and in elementary school to talk in systems. And as you said, it frequently, transition is thought of as starting at 14 and ending at 25. Well, I don't know about you, but I've been through many life transitions, including the transition from elementary school to middle school to high school, et cetera. So, but here, because the federal government came forth and funded a lot of programs that define transition in the law as starting at 16 or 14, depending on what year you're talking about, then that's what we all get used to. And then we want to educate each other about the system and how the system works. And it becomes a conversation, especially among parents and among families, of how do I get the information I need so that my son or daughter has a successful transition? How do I get on a waiting list? What are the good programs? And it's all this language about programs and systems. And I got to talk to the other parents to find out what the good programs are in this area and how these programs work so I can get my child into that program. But by the time my child reaches that age, there might be another program that is better than this program. So again, the language continues throughout the transitioning year, and the systems have created this language. If you can go to the next slide, please, Sean. So what happens, it starts with the school system, and the school system has, especially special education, has created a bunch of rules and things and paperwork and things they have to do to comply with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to continue to get the funding to fund the special education positions. And that has created this really obscene workload for special education teachers around the country. Then you've got the school system and the parents, and we educate people about how the school system works and how to make your way through the system and what special education program should you be part of and what label is attached to your child so they can qualify for special education programs. And then you go to the adult system, where, I mean, for years and years and years, I did a seminar called Transitioning from Entitlement to Eligibility, Crossing the Chasm. And it really is all about, okay, now we have adult systems. How do they work? And how do I navigate them like I learned how to navigate the school systems? And they're wait lists, so I got to get on there early. And it's all about programs. What are you eligible for? Which again, it gives structures to the professionals to enable them to show what they're doing and how many people they're serving, and then and how they are in compliance with the laws they need to be in compliance with. But you can see how this creates this systems thinking that we are in right now and that we've been in for my 30-year career in transition. And it really has to change.
And we've gotten a lot of great, we'll move on to the next slide, Ann. We've gotten a lot of great comments in the chat box. I just want to take a second for Luis and Dina to catch their breath for us. Perfect. So there's a lot of people are commenting to Laura what you had said and talking about, you know, systems being siloed and beings. There's some challenges existing with systems. Some work, some aren't working anymore. We can get back to the chat box a little bit later, but a lot of great participation. Keep it coming. Go ahead, Ann.
Okay, so what needs to change? Everything needs to change. How we think about services, how we organize services, how we deliver services. All of this needs to change. And how we present services as well, how that is presented to parents. And again, I am a firm believer that it starts with the language that we use, and the language that we use starting very early in a child's life. And that starts with family at home. And let's go on to the next slide, to the impact of systems thinking, because as much as I love talking about this, I want to get to the good part, the alternative to systems thinking. So what happens over time, and again, I think all three of us have seen this, as many in the audience have, we don't stop doing the old, we just add more new. And over time, more new gets added. For example, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and then the transition amendments came in. And then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and how does that fit in with all this? And then how can we show compliance? And then we have a WIOA, and how does that fit in? So it leads to more rules, and to prevent abuse and misuse, and to show compliance. And that leads to layers of programs, layers of rules, and resulted in decreased effectiveness and efficiency. And again, I think it's important to repeat, there's nothing wrong with the setting up these guideposts and systems to show compliance with federal laws, et cetera. They have to be in place so our schools can show compliance, our adult agencies can show compliance. So, and they are never going to go away as far as how the money is dispersed. Well, maybe someday, but not in my lifetime. So, but it's all, what requires changing is how we speak about it, and how we look at, and how we approach it, the thinking, and all the and again, first it starts with language. So meanwhile, while all this is happening, young adult is sitting at home waiting to get off the waiting list to get into the program that they want to get into. So now, Sean, I'm going to turn it back to you for a second, and then Laura gets the fun part to talk about what it can look like in the future.
Thank you, Ann. And you know, I think an interesting story that illustrates this. I had the opportunity to do listening sessions with families of adults, basically, who were in a DD service system, a developmental disabilities service system in a state. I won't name the state. And we were asked the families, essentially in the listening sessions, what they think a good life looked like for their son or daughter. And almost to a person, the families who we talked to in those listening sessions could only envision what life was like in the context of the services that they were getting currently. They had a very tough time envisioning wanting anything beyond what they were currently being offered. And I think that too is an impact of the systems thinking, is that over time, families come to just think, well, this is it. This is all this is all that we have. And I wonder what the impact that is on decision making. So Laura, I'd like you to jump in and see if you have any reaction to what Ann said about the impact. Or I wanted to ask you, what family advocates need to do to begin changing this mindset and kind of broadening things a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yes, I have a lot to say about what Ann has. Because I think that the things that we're hoping that you leave with is some of the really key points that Ann brought up. Language is powerful in our field. And somebody commented about using language that parents understand, which was super important. But I think also changing our language as professionals. This idea of programs doesn't work anymore if we're trying to move to a person-centered approach. And so when we talk about programs, we create these great programs. It's a systems way of thinking because people fit nicely into these programs until they don't. And then when they don't fit into the program, we create another program. And, I've been in employment for a really long time when it comes to transitioning youth with disabilities. And I remember when I first started in the field, supported employment was just part of the law. And everybody was so excited that supported employment was going to be the be all end all of employment for people with disabilities. That was going to, break things wide open. And like all good intentions come unintended consequences, because what happened is we ruined the concept of supported employment by making it a program. So now we have supported employment programs for whom now some people don't fit in that program. And so what did we do in response to that with our systems thinking is we created customized employment. And in my mind, customized employment is just really good supported employment. It's what I did when supported employment came around. So you have to start thinking, what's the next great thing then if now somebody doesn't fit under customized employment? And what is the next employment model? So when we think programs, we're thinking systems. We have to think services if we're really going to look at person-centered, if we're really going to look at individualization. It's got to be services. It can't be programs, because ultimately somebody's not going to fit into that program, and we're going to create a whole new program for people. And I'd like to just throw out there that the fact is we are all supported employees and we all have customized jobs. So it is not just for people with disabilities. So I think what Ann said is so important about the difference between programs and services. And then this idea of compliance. We have all this great legislation only for the rest of us in the profession to talk about compliance. Have we ticked every box? Have we done everything according to the law? And that's not person-centered. Again, we are talking about a person's life. So moving from that medical model, moving into services versus programs, and stop looking at compliance. I think those are some key things. So thank you for moving us on, Sean, because the reality is this is what we're looking for, right? We want to imagine this. So close your eyes for a moment and think about one road that finds community supports for that individual, that service system rather than a program, so that that individual, we meet them where they are and we move that individual forward. And it's a continuous movement forward to their life goals, not my life goals for them, not their parents' life goals for them, but where they see themselves. And then they grow and expand. And I always tell my students, think about services from travel. Like I like to travel a lot. And so let's say I want to go from Wisconsin to Florida. Now, some people might just say, if you want to go to Florida, just go straight south, just go through Illinois, go through Georgia, move on down and just go straight down and you'll be there in 8 to 12 hours. But what if I want a different road? What if I want to go to Florida from Wisconsin via California? Is that so wrong? Is that not the program I should be in? But it's the service I want, because think about the breadth and all the things that I'm going to see by traveling from Wisconsin via California to get to Florida. So one road is individualized. It's based on what that person wants. And so if we put that lifespan verbiage, which some people have commented in the chat box, that's exactly what we're looking for. And that's how we're going to move from programs to services. So really looking at and embracing a bright future for all individuals based on what they want, not based on what other people want or what the programs can offer, because programs can only offer a certain amount. So we want to provide services. And so that if we can change our language to focus on that, I think we'll be so much better off. So if we look at the next slide, when we think about what we can offer to parents and how we can help parents, these are kind of the three buckets of support that we think that parents are really looking for when it comes to kind of changing that systems thinking. We want to help them discover and navigate through what they need and what their individual student needs. So I was just at an IEP meeting the other day, and this young man was in an 18 to 21-year-old program, and he didn't fit because his behaviors didn't fit. And then when I started talking with him, it turns out that he didn't like it there. He didn't fit because he didn't want to be there. He didn't fit because he didn't fit into that program structure. And so the dad said something super profound. And I was like, thank you. Yes. He said, enough talking about what he can't do and why he gets upset and angry. Let's talk about what he can do and where he needs to go to be successful. And such a simple statement, but it's exactly what needed to be said at that moment, because everybody was thinking programs. And so we had to think about, how do we discover Nathan's talents and skills and abilities? And then how do we navigate and help him navigate so that he can reach the goals that he wants now and then move forward as he reaches those goals? The second bucket is connecting and networking, because that's really what it's all about. I mean, you know, Sean and Ann and I have been in this field for a long time, and we still learn about new connections and new people to network with. And so it's really important to connect families, connect young adults with disabilities to their communities, because their communities are the ones who are going to bring things together for them. They're going to see that individual as somebody who can contribute to their community, whether that's living in the community, whether that's going to the restaurant or the theater or working in the community. And then the third bucket is the services and supports that are based on services, not on programs, because services and supports aren't programmatic. They're based on what individuals actually need. So the next slide talks about what we can actually do. We can create that shared vision with a clear sense of directions for that one road. This is the direction. This is the direction this person wants to go, and these are the goals. And we have to have a sense of urgency. We have to really stop using the language that Ann talked about that says, you know, you got to fit in our little bubble, and people don't fit in that little bubble nicely. And we have to think differently beyond compliance. I mean, that should be our mantra. How do we move beyond compliance? Because we're gonna lose another generation of students if we don't have that sense of urgency. And quite honestly, individuals with disabilities don't have that kind of time anymore. We want them to be part of their community. So the change starts now. We no longer can blame the system. It's really us. We make up the system. So how do we kind of blast through that system's wall? We have to really enlist those allies and partners. You know, what educators are out there that we can pull in with our shared vision? What provider agencies, what state agencies, who are the people that we can pull in? Who are the self-advocates? I have a friend of mine, Cindy Bentley, who is an amazing self-advocate, and I bring her in all the time because she really has that vision, and she can really help us from a self-advocate perspective, help families and providers and educators. So who are those people that we can pull in and enlist their support in this idea of moving beyond compliance, moving beyond programs. And then think about the skills and supports to pull and push the system. How do we change that system? How do we say, okay, we are the people who created and have embraced this system. How do we unembrace it? How do we change it? And sometimes it's not a matter of change. It's a matter of just getting rid of that system altogether and starting over. Because when, as Anne mentioned, we start creating new, we just put the new on top of the old, and that doesn't change the system. So how do we kind of just dismantle what we have and start over? And then really important, talk about those successes. Talk about what's working and why it's working. It's working because we have dismantled the system. It's working because we're talking about services. It's working because we're not just focused on compliance. So these are the things that I think, and Anne and Sean, I believe, agree with me, think are really important that we can do to move things forward, to kind of break up this systems thinking and really change our language around what we do to support families and youth with disabilities.
So, and some of you have put in the chat box, you recognized, a good life, and you probably recognized the 3 buckets too, as coming from the Charting the Life course framework, which is, one of a number of really great person-centered planning type of frameworks. And so I want to throw it to Anne now to ask, really, how do we, when we have these big ideas, and Laura really touched on it too, how do we encourage person-centered thinking in families and then in advocates as well?
Yeah, I think it's great. I love you, Laura, dismantling the whole system. We're just going to start over from scratch here. Yes, let's do it. I think we're small but mighty. No, and listen, and I'm hopeful that that will happen over time. And absolutely, it can be done. However, I think we have to move away from system thinking one person at a time. And again, starting with language, get rid of systems and get rid of compliance and get rid of the vocabulary that keeps the systems thinking going, and start with the question, what does a good life look like? Start with that question early as possible, and keep talking about it in the families. What does a good life look like? And this can change over time. Obviously, it does for everybody. And so you start with that language, and then as you enter the transition time period, you look at how things are set up, how the systems are working, how the school system's working, everything, and you see how you can mold it to fit the picture that has been painted of a good life that you've been painting over time. You don't fit the systems, you fit the systems to the person, not the person to the system. So again, and hopefully over time, the demand, because the young adults who are served by the systems and the demand from the young adults is going to create a different kind of way of service that won't be all about programs and systems and will be more about one person at a time. Now, are we showing a video, Sean? Okay, all right. I wasn't sure what that was or not. So, and if we go on to the next slide, the ultimate goal is a person-centered system, because we said authentic life, imagining an authentic life. And that just means, what does a good life look like for this particular individual? That's what that means. And it's not a complicated concept. What does a good life look like? And then how do we put the supports in place that are needed to support that vision of the good life so that can be realized? And keep coming back to that. Like the father in that meeting says, what does a good life look like for my son or daughter? I just got another report of a young man, and it was from the behavior person. And the whole thing was negative. The whole thing was how to get this person to comply. There was not one word about future-oriented planning, anything about what the individual wanted to do later, and it is, and so we have to start. The people who use the services with the support of their family, they tell us how they want to live. They make use of all the resources to have the life they want, or as close as we can determine, and they get the support they need to make the first two happen. So then we are crafting the system around the individual, and that's what it should look like. And here's the approach. We've got person-centered thinking, which leads to person-centered practices to get everybody, including the program people, to talk about services, not programs, that leads to person-centered organizations, which create, ta-da, person-centered systems that support person-directed lives. This is such an essential concept, but it has to start with our shifting the way we think about it. And as people who work and with parents, you are in such a powerful position to help craft that picture and help give the parents and the youth language to talk about what does a good life look like. And that's where it all starts. Sean, I'm going to let you get a word in edgewise here.
No, you guys are, this is great. You know, we did have one comment, you know, and I think we want to acknowledge too, that we realize that families and you as professionals are still working within systems, right?
Yes.
So for some of you, this may be, you know, kind of like, well, you know, we still are doing this, so what are we supposed to do kind of thinking. And I think maybe what we would encourage you to do is kind of take a dual path, right? Parallel paths, where on one side, you're still advocating and providing information to families on how to navigate systems, how to take advantage of protection and advocacy. You know, what are the various supports available? But on that other path, right, I think is where we're taking you, which is helping families see that the real important stuff lies in what does a quality life look like, and how do we advocate for operating within systems that reaches those goals instead of reaching some type of weird systems goal that may or may not relate to what the person wants to do. But I just wanted to acknowledge that. I wanted to acknowledge that we're not saying, oh, just get rid of all systems and everything's going to be rosy. We realize this is a process. And so that really leads me very well into the last question that I have, and this is going to go to Laura, which is, how do we get there? Like just some thoughts, you knowing that this is probably more of a beginning of a conversation than a complete, we have all the answers type of situation. What are some strategies, Laura, that you've been thinking about?
Yeah, so, you know, we've been doing it the hard way, to be honest with you. And so, you know, some of the people in the chat have made some really good comments. I think, you know, we just have to bust through some of the system barriers that are out there. So for example, this transition course that I'm teaching has kindergarten teachers, elementary teachers, middle school teachers, and high school teachers. And I think somebody in the chat had mentioned how, you know, it's lifelong process and it doesn't start at age 14. And this is how I'm trying at my level to kind of break down that barrier. That is exactly right. That is a barrier that we just put in, okay, age 14 or age 16, that's the magic age when we think about transition. But I challenge my students and I tell them, okay, so when did you start doing chores? when did you start learning about jobs and careers? I mean, I remember in first grade, we had career day and we brought our parents in and they talked about their careers. I remember having chores from the time I was little. So those little things kind of bust open that we don't wait till 14 just because the law says that's when we talk about transition. Transition is lifelong. Transition is something that we talk about in early childhood. And quite honestly, transition from school to adult life came about because of the good transition from early childhood to elementary school. That is the whole impetus of transition to begin with. So that system worked. And then we, again, unintended consequences led into this system that, okay, so we don't have to worry about it till a student is 16 or 14. So I think that we really need to think about, what do we know is working? And let's continue with that. And what do we need to change? And how do we need to push that envelope? Instead of saying words like, can this student with more significant disabilities work? The question is, how, where? That's what we should be talking about. It's never can. Can the student go on to post-secondary education? How do we make that happen if that's what they want? And so I think listening more is really important. Listening to our young adults with disabilities, listening to families, talking to families early. I actually had my students do some of the life course work with their families, and they were blown away that families actually were thinking about these things when their child was 5 and 6 years old. I think we need to just really kind of sit back and not think about what can't happen. And I think, Sean, you're right. It's not, we're asking people to, tomorrow break down every system that's there, but to challenge, to feel comfortable to challenge and say, this is how we want it to be for this particular young adult. How do we get it to happen? Who can we bring on board to help make it happen? Student-led IEPs. I hear all the time, well, when they're in high school, we'll work on that. Why? Let's start in elementary school. How powerful would it be for a first grader or a second grader to lead their own IEP? People talk differently about young adults and children when the child is sitting in the room. And, some young kids have very profound things to say about what they like, what they don't like, what they struggle with. And so let's have students be part of that process. Maybe they don't have to sit in the entire IEP, but maybe the part of it where they talk about their present level of performance, maybe the part where we talk about their goals and what they would like to see their goals to be. So those are some things that I think we can do now that will help kind of dissolve some of these artificial barriers that systems have set up. So one of my favorite people in the whole wide world is Albert Einstein, because I think he did break down so many barriers and made us really rethink our systems issue. And I really like this quote that we need to ask ourselves, what do we know before we ask, what do we do? And Albert Einstein said, if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem. And that's what we need to do. We need to define what the issue is. And then that last 5 minutes is now, here's what we can do. So I think that, we have a big challenge, but I know that everybody on this webinar and everybody at TransCen is really willing to kind of move things forward and change our thought process and listen more to individuals with disabilities and their family. And really slowly kind of chip away at those barriers that we've artificially set up in our systems model thinking.
Thank you, Laura. I before we jump into questions here, a couple of things. First of all, Dina and Luis, thank you again for keeping up with us. And thanks to everybody. The chat has been great. A lot of wonderful examples and questions. To me, the number one takeaway here is that we need to change the way we frame transition to families. Yeah. And it's not saying to families, here are the services that people with disabilities get at this age, and then that's transition. it's empowering individuals and families to think about transition in terms of what a quality life looks like, and then seeing if the services fit, but then also being people who are champions for people with disabilities. We need to begin changing this conversation and begin kicking up some dust a little bit. It's time for us to disrupt some of these systems that frankly are old and haven't been reimagined in quite some time, to say, as Laura put it, you know, we don't want to lose time with our people. We want people to have great outcomes. And are we truly getting that with the systems we have? Questions? Johan, did you want to facilitate this, or would you like me just to jump into the Q&A and go for it?
This is Johan. I'm the virtual training coordinator for RAISE. Sean, thank you for bringing me in. I can go ahead and bring the questions forward. I would just say, I second what Sean said. Thank you for all the interpreters, for Luis and Dina. I appreciate it. And I appreciate making this more accessible to all of us. I'll start with the first question for the team. Do other states, area agency, or similar provide person-centered planning?
So Anne or Laura, it looks like the question is, you know, like how widespread do you see the implementation of person-centered planning around the country?
So I can speak, you know, it's in the laws, it's in IDEA, and it's in the WIOA, Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act. And so here's some things, it happens, but only when people push the envelope and say, this is what I want to happen. I know that, for example, vocational rehabilitation is supposed to provide a list of agencies that the individual can interview and the family can interview. But typically what happens is the VR counselor will say, here's the agency that we're going to recommend for you. And so it's up to us to kind of say, well, can we have that list so that we can interview these agencies? Not all agencies are the same. Not all agencies may be the best fit. So I think in pockets, it is happening, but I think more so we as professionals in the field, advocates, and individuals with disabilities need to be asking and demanding, quite frankly, that they want to be in the driver's seat, that they don't want to be given a list, as Sean, you mentioned, you know, here's the list of services in your area, or here are the list of programs in your area. Okay, here's what we want. And if it's not there, then we need to create it. So if I want my son, I think somebody had mentioned about their son or daughter wanting to open a barbershop or a salon. Okay, if nobody in my community is able to help support that, then we have to find somebody. We don't just shut the door and say, oh, that's not possible because there's no programs for it. Then we need to kind of push that envelope and say, okay, then we need to find somebody who can help support that. So I think that there are pockets around the country that it is happening in school districts and at state agencies. But even though we talk about it, I don't think it's happening as much as we'd like to see it.
Excellent.
Yeah, and Sean, I just wanted to add, I know a lot of people, because I can feel the audience saying, well, we can't just get rid of systems. We can't just go and abolish the whole system. And again, I would just repeat that it starts with the planning and planning early. And it starts with the question, what does a good life look like? What does equality look like? And that changes the entire conversation and the language of the entire conversation. So that's where you start. And the systems change will come over time because, as Laura said, that's going to create a demand for services that may not be there right now. But that's how it happens, is over time. So it's, and yes, we can highlight places that are doing it right now and show best practices and things and call attention to that, which is great. But every single solitary individual in their own locality can change the conversation tomorrow and start from that question, what does a good life look like? And then figure out how to get there with the person-centered planning. So just wanted to throw that in.
And I do think also that we have to understand that people change over time. And so I always hear too, like, well, they said they wanted to do this and now they want to do that. And I'm like, yeah, that's what happens. You experience the world, and at 10, you might want to do one thing, but at 15, you might want to do something else. And at age 21, you might do something totally different. That's life. And so a good life might look different at different phases of your life as well.
Next question, Johan.
Thank you for that. Next question. I love the concept of services over programs, but we have to deal with the program. So what exactly are you suggesting we do? We do as advocates, pick and choose the services from all the different programs according to the individual.
So yes, there are programs out there and we talk about programs, but to Anne's point, I think that's what we can change tomorrow. We can say, here are the services. So when somebody says, so with this young man's IEP, when they said, here's our 18 to 21-year-old program, the parents and I said, so these are the services that he needs. Can you provide those services? And if you can't, then let's find somebody who can, either within the system, in the school system, or outside. So I think those are the quote easy things that we can do, is just simply change the language. If you keep talking about services, then that programmatic language is going to change. I think that we just have to keep going back to, what are the services this person needs to reach the goals that they are setting for themselves? And so I think that's where it's that systems mindset, because I think we're so ingrained into, well, the school district is just offering this program. Well, it's not what we need. So these are the services that we need. He doesn't need to be in a self-contained field house with other 18 to 21-year-old students just hanging out. He wants to do something. So the behaviors are actually occurring because he's bored and he wants to do something. So here are the things he likes. How can we help? How can we make that happen? What are the services that we can implement?
So we're at time here. We only have just literally 2 minutes left. And I wanted to thank Anne and Laura for having this conversation. We could literally talk about this all day.
Yes.
And maybe we'll get a chance to talk with you guys again in the future. Just did want to point out, however, that we're from TransCen. So if you're interested in what we do, our website is transcen.org. We've got an email for some inquiries. We do training and technical assistance around the country. And we're very active on the social media world. And so if you are an Instagrammer or a Facebooker or a whatever, go ahead and like us and follow us and see what we've got going on. So I'm actually going to go backwards here then. You feel free to contact us at any time. You've got our emails there. And we, we're very responsive and happy to talk to you further if you have any other reactions or questions to what was said in the session today. But I want to throw it to Josie for a last word before we close.
I just want to thank everybody for their comments. They were amazing. I was reading through them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all for being interactive, and team, thank you so much for this great presentation and the translation and interpretation. It was really great. And I think that the first step is just the talking and thinking about better lives, and start bringing it up with families. That families and youth have a choice. And it's not just here's the answer for everyone. So it's a conversation. I really appreciate you all starting that conversation with us today. Please fill out our evaluation. We seriously read those comments, and we love the feedback. And we have some webinars coming up in 22, blow my mind, that I hope that you will join us for. That will also be fantastic. But thank you for everything. This recording, both in English and Spanish, plus the handouts and the PowerPoint, will be coming to those individuals who registered for this. It may take a few days for us to get the captions and everything back to you, but you will receive it in your email. So thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day. Bye.